Human Rights Month in South Africa, we have dedicated a 5-session series of podcasts to spirit-led race conversations. Tonight is session 2, and we will be continuing for the next 3 weeks every Tuesday at 7 p.m. until the 30th of March. For me, in these challenging times, the wisdom of the ancient chakra system is proving time and again to be such a solid teacher. And I'm excited to learn more how this energy system will support our spirit-led race conversations tonight. There is so much to talk about. I thank and again welcome with an open heart our guides for this series, Dr. Makgati Mokwena and Ilze Olckers, with much gratitude.
Thank you, Cindy, and it's so good to be back and to get us going into our session. We start always with the mindfulness practice, and this evening we are calling in the grandmothers. And we are calling in the grandmothers. I'll give a bit of context. On Saturday, it was my birthday, and I got taken to the river for some rituals, for some deep, deep cleansing. And whilst I was there, I had a distinct calling of the grandmothers. I had it, I felt it, and I heard it. The grandmothers saying, "Where are we in your life?" And so we call in the grandmothers. I'm going to light impeppo and do an invocation, a calling in of all our grandmothers. And I invite you to go into yourself and to listen to the identity, to the self of your own grandmothers. And I start by calling in all our immediate grandmothers, those that gave birth to our father, our mother, and those that gave birth to our grandmothers on both sides, and those that gave birth to those grandmothers, and so on, until we get all the way to the back. And we remember that the grandmother is the one who shows up when all has left, when everybody has left. We always have the grandmother who is there to offer support, the one who holds. And we thank you for offering comfort in comfortless moments, for offering wise guidance in moments when we were lost, for offering a welcoming embrace when we have run far away from ourselves, for holding up the light when we were hell-bent on getting lost in our own inner stories, for holding up deep wisdom when the stories of the world have made great noise inside our minds, inside our hearts, inside of our psyche, ensuring that we get lost and never really find our way back home. We thank all the grandmothers for being there for us. And we call you today, and I will call in my own grandmothers, Gugu Memushabi, Mushabelo, and my Gogo Martha. I call all of you, I invite all of you to call your own grandmothers to step forward, whether they are still incarnate in this world or whether they have passed on. We call on all of you to be with us tonight, to hold a greater perspective, to remind us of why we are here. And as I do that, I offer an invitation in a tiny poem that I wrote. And it says, if you long to meet your true self in this world, Behold the faces of the dark tribe. Bow, for you are looking into the face of God. We are here. Ilze.
Oh, and so be it, Makgati, and so be it. And a blessed, blessed birthday. I wished you on the weekend. I wish you again this evening. I'm sure every single person on this call is extending all that love to you and giving thanks for your life. So thank you for the grandmothers. And it was so perfect because, of course, we come to this conversation this evening from International Women's Day yesterday. And I went back again and just went to look again at the origins of International Women's Day, because these days become quite meaningless. You know, they become quite meaningless and they're almost treated like, you know, one Mother's Day after the other, and commercialized and sort of sentiment, you know, with a lot of sentimentality. And I was reminded again that the roots of International Women's Day is really profound. It's really profound. It comes from struggle, and it comes with incredible solidarity that happened all over the world towards the end of the First World War. And so I want to acknowledge those grandmothers that stood up and marched at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century. And they were at the time they were marching to end the war, and they were also marching for improved labor conditions. They were all in the factories at that time, and for the vote, of course. They didn't have the right to vote, and the roots are in the socialist movement, which was beautiful to rediscover. But the thing that really if you go and do a little bit of research, you'll be blown away by the solidarity of these women across the planet. But the thing that really moved me about it was that their chants, the initial chants, were for bread and peace. Bread and peace. And I thought that led us so beautifully into this evening's conversations, where it's about the sanctity of life. It's about the end of war, which is this first chakra, this base chakra of incarnating this precious, precious human life that we have. But it's also about bread. It's about security. It's about economic systems. It's about justice, socioeconomic justice. And from the beginning, from the inception of International Women's Day, these two themes of bread and peace and justice were kind of linked. And I thought that was a beautiful way into this evening. But before we dive into the chakras, we wanted to just connect a little bit to, particularly for the new participants who are joining us this evening, to how we began last time, just to this idea of how we contract with each other when we enter into these race conversations, and what sort of stood out for us around that. And I know that you had something that stayed very alive for you out of the contracting conversation.
Yeah, it was the idea of courage. It was the idea of courage, and the courage to stand with whatever arises. These conversations, of course, we call them spirit-led, and we know that when spirit is present, we can really only show up with surrender and with deep, deep courage, because more than that, we are not in charge. And so the practice, not just the idea, but the practice of courage is called for through these conversations, and really understanding that we are in service of something much bigger than ourselves. It is about us. The story is ours, And yet it is in service of something much bigger, of that which is over and above what we can even imagine. And in that, we really are calling for hearing with a different ear, with understanding differently, and with the courage to look and to keep looking and to look again and to look again until we are aligned to what Spirit would have us understand. And that for me is one of the things that that I would like to offer, is let's have the courage to look again. Yeah. And for you, Ilze?
Thank you for that, Makgati, because it links into something, that I think as having been racialized white, and to come and lived as a white, to come as a white person, to come into these conversations, there is something that is asked of us specifically as white people, how we enter into these conversations, something very particular. And so that invitation that you've issued about bring some kind of reflection with you in terms of how you enter into these conversations. Bring some degree of self-awareness, self-consciousness with you as you enter into these conversations. Do not assume that you are owed these conversations. Do not assume that you're entitled to have these conversations. Do not assume that these conversations need to happen on your terms. Know that you're entering sacred space. And we shared the poem last time about the Archbishop chairing the first session of the TRC, and just that notion of how it starts with recognizing the pain. I read an article this week that really, the title just really captured my imagination, and it was, the title is "My Pain is Not Your Classroom." And I just thought that was so powerful, so powerful. And so we have to enter into these conversations with real sensitivity and with courage, as you said.
And with a willingness, I think also with a willingness to allow our stories to be educative, but knowing that we are not owed that. It really is a state of grace, being able to show up with our own stories and have them heard. Well, have ourselves tell those stories first. And perhaps even as we tell them, we hear them with a different ear. And as we do that, perhaps we issue the invitation to be heard in a different way, in a new way. And perhaps it's the same story, but we bring new understanding to the story.
Beautiful, beautiful. Because that really is the essence of transformation, isn't it? Is to be able to look with new eyes, to be able to understand in a new way, to have that enlargement. So what I want to check in with you, we thought that we wanted to touch on this idea of white fragility, because it seemed to be the concept that came out of our last conversation that had so much electricity. And it was the one concept that had comments coming from a range of perspectives, from a range of responses. And we thought we wanted to just touch on that before we then sort of entered into the substantive part of our first two chakras. Did you want to kick us off about that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that got activated in me when I saw some of the comments, particularly around the difficulty, the contested phrase, white fragility, I paused and contemplated exactly what it is that we are saying. And I sort of understood where the comment came from. And at the same time, there was this rising of an understanding that perhaps the term itself is important to be acknowledged, because what it is saying is highlighting a view of the binaries that we find ourselves in, the polarities that we find ourselves in, that whilst there is absolutely this sense of white fragility and what can be said in the company of white people, or what can be, how do we show up as Black people in the company of white people? Are we going to be offending? Are we going to be triggering the sense of the angry Black, or whatever it is? It feels like it carries a lot of weight around the expectation of attack. If you think about it, if something is fragile, right on the other side of it, there is this sense of somebody is attacking the thing that is fragile, and therefore this thing that is fragile needs protection. And I think it touches on what we spoke about last week, which is the idea of the lack of maturity, of the lack of stamina, of resilience, and a sense of this has to be protected and whiteness has to be protected. So whilst I was thinking about it, I realized that it is important to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that perhaps we are on a path, we are on a journey, and white fragility is one stop along the journey of transformation, of healing, because it impacts both of us. It impacts white people as much as it impacts people who are not white. And perhaps as we move along and we heal the part of ourselves that feels so subject to attack, or we feel subject to be the attacker, that as we heal these binaries, we can finally enter into a space of vulnerability. And both of us can enter into that really beautiful space of potential healing and vulnerability. There's great strength in vulnerability. There's very little strength in white fragility. If one stops there, one has to move through in order to get to vulnerability. And from vulnerability, perhaps we can start being honest and real with one another, with this is what we are dealing with, and we need to release one another from this contract of insanity, of racism. Racism is a form of insanity.
That's so beautiful. And when we spoke about that, in preparation for this evening, and when you shared that whole sense of, moving from the state of fragility into this robust vulnerability, I could just feel it in my body, how different that is from that defensive stance of I am not a racist and don't call me racist, and just the all of that. But then on the other hand, there's also, the calling out culture, and the calling out culture is not only, Black people onto white people, but there is also, those of us, and I include myself, diversity trainers, transformation consultants, those of us who really want to be the best whites. That's one of my favorite terms. So I must thank Rebecca for that term, this need to be the best white. And then very often, you can actually get to a place where you are the one, doing this kind of calling out of white fragility. But the comments, there was a comment in the chat about, what were the different comments. And just to say, without taking up too much time, that there were a range of comments. Some of them were about how the term white fragility even protects white people even more, that when white people show behaviors that one could term white fragility, it is actually perpetrating another form of violence on the Black people in that conversation, when you unable to kind of hear what is being said, when you present in a defensive way. But then the comments also went all along the continuum of other comments that said, these are profound learning moments. And to name and shame is not going to, result in any kind of transformation and healing. So, the naming and the shaming is not helpful either. So, yeah, I think that it is a conversation that we could probably spend a whole hour on, and maybe we'll do a follow-up one at some point. But just to acknowledge that we're all learning. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, white fragility was a concept that I loved because it provided language for something that up until that time we didn't have language for. But I have really kind of moderated my position on that, and also because I've read some Black authors that have written some scathing things about the term white fragility. I read one, let me see if I can quickly come to his name, John McWhorter, a professor at Columbia University. And his article was called The Dehumanizing Condescension of White Fragility. And he talks about how it's just another form of racism. It's this way in which it morphs, and a way in which it keeps Black people infantilized. So very interesting conversations. So thank you for the comments that have kind of enriched both Makgati and I's thinking and revisiting around the language that we use. And this is an ongoing process of learning and unlearning something that's useful at some point. One then matures into maybe moving into a different direction. Shall we move into a different direction? Shall we move towards our base and sacral chakras?
No, absolutely. And of course, we have said that we will be framing these conversations within the perspective, the view of the chakra system. And of course, as we know, maybe as not all of us know, but it's an Indian Veda system that helps us understand the energy centers that lie within the body, and the energy centers that really are aligned to our functioning, that is aligned to that are aligned to what is able, the energy, the life force that is able to flow freely inside of us, inside of our body, and therefore assist our physical organs, but also assist us emotionally and spiritually to not only function, but really to thrive. So chakras are energy systems that are found inside the body. Then, because we're talking race, this is about our conversation with one another. We realized also that these chakras can exist between us. So not only are they intra-personal, but perhaps they also exist interpersonally. And the idea, the longing is to bring them into alignment and to bring them into flow and bring them into balance. Because it's only when the system is in good balance that energy is able to move freely, giving life to every organ within the body and giving life to every single one of us, depending on how the energy flows between us. So we really liked the system. And I know, Ilze, that you've got something to say about how it's also found, the system itself is also found in Egypt, or has some origin also in Egypt. Yeah, ancient Egypt.
Yes, so a very profound moment for me happened when I discovered an old, one of those ancient papyrus drawings, Egyptian drawings, of the scales of justice. And on that drawing were these very distinct 7 nodes. And there's a beautiful story about the Egyptian goddess of justice, which I'm going to keep for, I think, our very last session when we talk about the crown chakra. But it led me to go and look at Egypt. And also, of course, Egypt is on our African continent, and it's indigenous to us. And there's so much. I mean, Cindy will also know how much wisdom and indigenous wisdom and how much power sits with the Egyptian kind of culture and the Egyptian history and stories. But the thing that I love so much about the Egyptian approach, or the way it works with the chakras, is that it considers the Nile. So this is, I'm not an expert, but this is some of what I've read, that it considers the Nile actually as a representation of the backbone. And with the final delta, actually then also again, that beautiful delta image, actually representing also the kind of the crown chakra. And that all along the sacred points, the sacred chakra points of the Nile, in very important sacred sites can be found. And you can actually journey the journey of the Nile and pass these sort of sacred sites. And so it's also something that, of course, is on the land, in the land. So, yeah, we thought that this would be a system that is complex enough to contain, or to be the container for the complexity of the conversation that Makgati and I wanted to have. Because racism is totally complex. It is a complex phenomenon. It's a living system, and it's a complex, adaptive living system. And we needed something that was worthy of the complexity of this phenomenon within which to have this conversation. Yeah. So yeah, I think the Egyptians identify 13 chakra points, but it's the 7 classic Vedic chakra points with a few others added in. I know the hands are also one, but I can't remember what some of the others are. So yeah, so that brings us then to the base chakra, which is this incarnation, this idea of identity, of family, this absolute rooting, this coming into being and rooting, identity, family, embodiedness, survival really sits there at the root chakra. So do you want to lead us in to anything you want to,
I mean, for me, and I think for a lot of people who see themselves as being spiritual, I think that we tend to give a lot of attention to the upper chakras, you know, from the heart upward. And very often we forget about the base chakras. You know, certainly the first 3, we tend to forget about those, and because we feel like, we don't want to be on this earth. Humanity is just too crazy, and we want to commune with our galactic sisters. Our interstellar home is where we want to go back to. But part of our agreement into coming into this world is that we have gems, we have moments of learning that are embedded within our bodies. And so the human experience is a spiritual journey. And it's been really profound for me to see how I keep being brought back into the body. I mean, even being at the river on Saturday is part of being brought back into Makgati. Your spirituality needs to be embodied. Every single experience that you are having as a human being is part of your spiritual journey, and therefore pay attention and choose your responses. And of course, race is such a huge determining factor of who we are in the world, and has been a huge determining factor of who I am. And as a racialized body, I mean, I don't know if I really remember this, or if I made it up, or if it's somewhere embedded and maybe it's inherited through I don't know. But I have a distinct memory of recognizing the play of race and the stories of race. When I was very young, I can't remember, but I must have been really, really young, and watching my father have an interaction with a white woman. And you have to know my father. My father was a powerful man, strong man. There wasn't a thing he couldn't do, even though he didn't have much education, but he taught himself to what is that beautiful writing that people do? You know, when they print and they make all sorts of, I can't remember what that writing.
Calligraphy.
My father taught himself. he never, I don't think he went beyond standard 5. But he taught himself calligraphy. He taught himself to print photographs. He found an old camera and he took pictures, and he converted a small, a shack at home and knew how to print photographs. He knew how to fix cars. He knew how to build. He knew, he had us as children. So he was a powerful figure. And that I didn't make up, because I know that. And my very first experience of something else other than my own self was watching my father have an interaction with a white woman, and how my father became small so that this white woman could be big, or so that her big identity could be recognized. He didn't say anything to me about how we interact with one another in the world, but I saw that, and that landed inside of me and became a meaning-making frame of what it means to be somebody who is not white, and what it means for that white person to be somebody who is not Black. And the agreed upon tacit agreement that this is how we treat one another. And that stayed with me most of my life. And I think it's only a few years ago, that I have recognized that, no, this is not okay. I've known in my head cognitively that this is not okay, but because this information that holds so much energy has been lying deep inside of my psyche, I have responded with a particular intention to white people that intention having really not much to do with me. So we're talking base chakra, we're talking belonging, we're talking being here on earth, we're talking identity formation. And here's the crazy bit, is how insane is it that our identity is based on a story. It's based on a false notion of who we are, and we all protect it, and we all have gone along with it. And so that journey of emancipation is a big one. It's a massive task, because part of this inheritance is stuff that is even maybe it's even archetypal, which is even more difficult to grapple with. And I have watched myself find great struggle with untangling myself from this thin air that I have put so much value into, and have gone along with it. Yeah.
Sure. So powerful. So powerful. And I think what you're talking about is this idea of race as something real. And we know that it's not. We know that from a biological point of view, and all the research and all the DNA and all of this, it's not real. It is a social construct. It is a complete social construct. And yet, as you say, the craziness of how we buy into that and we live from that place. But at the same time, our whole society, our whole community has been created based on those markers, based on all of those different dimensions. And so we can't ignore it. We yearn, as you say, to be in the upper chakras, and we will see how racialized our experience of those upper chakras also are in our subsequent conversations. But we live in a world that is profoundly racialized and unequal, and so that calls us. I read somewhere that the bottom 3 chakras is considered to be the well of suffering. I love that. I didn't love it, But I thought that was a beautiful way, the well of suffering, and that we draw as we go back to those base fears of survival, being killed in your sleep by a black person, or being overtaken. The Brits and the Americas are all calculating at which point, which year are these nations going to no longer be white dominant. Will the brown bodies outnumber the white bodies? I've heard somebody speak to that phenomenon as the fear of the black planet, the fear of the black planet, the fear of your kind of obliteration. And yet, as you said, it's based on something completely false. So my first racialized story, I'm watching the time, and I'm I wish we had another half an hour onto this call. My first racialized experience was also when I was very small. I must have been 4 or 5. And as I mentioned last time, I grew up in Makanda in Grahamstown, and I don't know if other people recall, but when I was in the early 60s, when I was born, when I was a toddler, there was still a siren that went off at like 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the evening. There was a siren. And I asked my parents, what is this siren that goes off every night? And they said, this means that all the black people have to be in their location. They have to all be where they belong, and we are all here where we belong. This is this is in my lifetime. And I remember knowing that this can't be right, that this can't be right. This can't be right. And I remember seeing black people come into the town and then leave, at 5, 6 o'clock, leave like a wave, leave the white suburb, to go back to the black townships that was on the other side of town. But the thing that I think that's significant is, in terms of my own story, is that, and it might be ironically because I grew up in a very political home, is that I never forgot that feeling of this is wrong, this cannot be true, this is unnatural, this cannot be. I never forgot that feeling. And I think what happens with many white people is that we are born with that innate sense of justice and oneness, but the world that's reflected back to us that is so structurally racist imprints on us. And then as we internalize that, we begin to participate and perform this racism because we forgot what we did once know. So yeah, that's a little bit, that's just a little bit about me, and of course it set up a lifelong painful set of relationships with my immediate family, which was part of my particular story. But Makgati, the other thing that we thought that was interesting about the base chakra is also the idea of land. And I know that it's time for us to move on to the second chakra urgently, but I don't think we can move on without just asking you to say a few words about land, because in this country, you can't have the conversation about race without touching on the question of land.
Sure. Oh my gosh. Well, and I'm feeling this thing of these are race conversations, these are spirit-led conversations, and perhaps I'm going to bring another aspect of land that is not the obvious aspect of land, and maybe it is obvious to a lot of us, to many people, but it is the reminder of the importance of land for the African. There is an interconnectedness to the land for the African. And it is that place within which we place our deceased and it's the deceased that are our ancestors. And that relationship with the ancestors is paramount. It is a critical, they are part of our reality. They are not, dead and forgotten, but they form an integral part of who we are. And so when Black people, when we were removed over and over and over again from different parts of lands in order to make way for white people. And that removal hasn't only been about the living people, but has also been the overtaking of burial spots without any attention to the recognition that this is holy land. Tread softly, tread lightly, tread with a sense of the sacred. When that happened, the injury became very, very massive. It became really big because it's gone straight into the substance of who we are. What happens when you cannot go and honor your deceased where you had laid them to rest? That is big. I mean, when my sister passed away, and this is a practice that often happens when somebody dies away from their home. One thing that happens is that the family goes to fetch the spirit of that person from out there if they've died in the bush in a car accident. And that's something that we did when my sister passed away, is that we had to go and fetch her spirit and lay her to rest, so that she could then join the tribe of ancestry and therefore be able to serve us, the living, in a particular way. So that the loss of the land, it touches the spiritual as much as it touches the political. And so you have those two meet one another, and they just form an even bigger urgency of, come on, this is not okay. This is more than not okay. I don't even have the words to speak about that. And it's, so I want to quickly then touch on the Ubuntu aspect, and the principle of Ubuntu, because it speaks about interdependence, and it's saying that I am because we are. And the we is much bigger than just the family system, than the family unit. It speaks about those that are living and those that have passed on. It speaks of the community. It speaks of the community surrounding the community. It speaks of, so these layers are all interdependent. And so this journey, this journey of being human, as far as Ubuntu is concerned, it is a reminder that this walk through the human body, of course you take it on your own, but you do not walk alone. You walk with one another. And in order to traverse through it with more than survival, but with thriving, you have to pay honor to those that are around you and those that have come before you in the form of the ancestors, knowing that our journey leads all of us in the same direction. But these relationships, and so when we're speaking issues of race and racism, we're constantly talking about how we have cut ourselves off from ourselves because we're connected. And so we keep cutting ourselves off from one another, which means that all of us get to lose. It's not just Black people who get to lose. It's not just white people who get to lose, because the significance of where we are going is massive. The journey through life is a big journey, and we have to remember where our destination is.
And that's that fear of survival, that root chakra thing that motivates us. Not only is it a complete false story, the racialization, the actual construct of race, but also this idea that we're separate from one another, and that there is a separate self to protect, when in fact we exist in interdependence. And as we then move to the second chakra, what came up very strongly for us. So the second chakra then, both these chakras are very tribal, not tribal in an African sense of African tribes, but as in our sort of families and cultures of origin. It's of course to do with the second chakra, to do with money, to do with sexuality, to do with power, but still very much in that tribal context. And there were two things that came up for us when we thought about this in terms of that second chakra. The first, of course, is the sexuality issue, and what it means in an embodied way to be both Black and female. This idea of intersectionality and how and what that means, because a Black woman, this is another quote I read. I love these little quips that say things better than I could say them. Black women are not just white women with color.
Yeah.
It is, and so there's this thing of what is that experience? And of course, when we look at that second chakra, the issue of sexuality, we also look at gender-based violence and the disproportionate vulnerability that many women of color have because of the structural racism, the systemic racism that just makes them more vulnerable. With these sort of myriad of interlocking systems that makes them more vulnerable. And the other theme that came up for us was the theme of wealth and the theme of intergenerational wealth, and how how big a theme that is in the South African context. That, and also how that relates to this idea of Black tax, which is such an interesting sort of concept. I know it, I think it is possibly, offensive coming from a white person also, but I know that you also have a very particular sort of angle around some of those themes.
Yeah. So I love that thing that a Black person is not a Black woman is not a, however way you said it. I love that. I love that. And sometimes we forget and we think that that's what it means. But from, you're talking about the idea of wealth, and you're talking, because we're talking second chakra. And the piece that I wanted to bring is conceiving of wealth in all its manifestations, in all its colors. And I'm speaking like this precisely because we are exploring other ways of understanding. We've explored how the idea of capitalism and patriarchy and the distribution of wealth has been an utter devastation upon Black bodies. We know that. And in a way, when we in a way there's a sense of defining us into a deficient, the deficient race. If you think of Africa as the hungry race, as the poverty-stricken, with flies around our, the corner of our mouth and distended abdomens, and that's the image that people have of Africa. And people cannot even conceive of an Africa that has something to give, of an Africa that has a wisdom that it can share with the world. And so the part that I would like to bring into this conversation is, how about, whilst we hold the idea of the craziness of the distribution of wealth and how it's excluded us, Black people, but on the other hand, how about we start thinking about wealth in a particular way, in a different way? And for instance, the wealth that I have inherited, that has been distributed to me, is the traditional healing gifts that I have received from my mother, who received it from her grandfather, who received it from. So there's all these gifts that run in my blood, and that is not subject to anybody. It's not this cannot be taken away. These gifts are salient. They form a critical part of me. So regardless of where I may be placed, this body and all that it has been given can never be imprisoned, because my gifts are not, they're not sitting on the surface. They're sitting deep inside of me. And so absolutely, I've had to jump over many hurdles. Black people constantly have to jump over many hurdles. Hurdles that are put in place by patriarchy, by racism, by all sorts of things. And as we jump over these hurdles, we also, perhaps as we jump and we bring a particular perspective and we bring a particular understanding, and maybe something in us opens up, that perhaps as we jump over the hurdles, perhaps we get to a quiet place within. And perhaps it's a quiet place that says, these hurdles that you have been jumping, and the jumping could have been through activating for activism for proper distribution, activating for education, all of those, speaking up when things are not okay, standing up and showing up in my own power when stuff is not okay, when people don't think that I would have any power. All of these are ways of jumping over the hurdle. And perhaps at some point we start kicking the hurdle out of the way because we've practiced. We are so well practiced at encountering the hurdle that we find different ways of navigating our way over them or around them. And as we do that and we bring that, I don't know, maybe grace acts upon us and says, sit down, pause a bit, and recognize that this journey that seems to be taking place outside of you, that has been undertaken by your body, is actually a journey deep within. And perhaps then we get to meet our true identity. And our true identity is not subject to being rattled by the things of the world. And the rattling of the world will continue, and we can listen to it and be able to recognize, oh no, I want to say it's just white people over there doing their thing, it's fine. But no, it's just all of us. It's all of us going on and doing our, rattling and doing our thing. And we will come back to a quiet place. And I think that the journey of our bodies on this earth, on this Mother Earth, isn't only about the jumping over hurdles, but it's also a journey towards something that is far more substantive, something that cannot be touched, something that cannot, it's not to be nourished by the food that we eat, but it's nourished by spirit. But it takes place through the body.
It takes place through the body. I mean, Makgati, that was so beautiful about the reframing of wealth. And then on the other hand, as well as there is also, this dilemma as a white person when you have, in fact, inherited not large amounts of wealth, but you do have a degree of security that is, that is unearned, utterly unearned. And my colleague Pierre de Vos, he's a professor of human rights at UCT, and he's a long-time activist. And some of you will know that he's been very vocal on this issue of, a scrapping of inheritance. And it really touches a nerve. It touches a nerve. So it's an unfinished conversation. That is what I just want to acknowledge, is that it's an unfinished conversation, because it is a structural advantage that white people have that is based on an unjust system over generations. And what does one do with that? What does one do with that?
So I have this, just as you were speaking, I wanted to say, and I know I interrupted, I apologize. But when you were saying, what does one do with this? Number one is recognize that when we stand in the space of fragility, I'm using that term really, that word very, very loosely, that when we step into that space, that there will be somebody who will quickly remind you that you are standing here, your wealth is being challenged by that Black person and by the Black, what did you call it? The Black earth. So beware. You will end up with a scrapping of inheritance or whatever it is, the scarcity. When we step into that, somebody will quickly rise up and say, it's because it's the Blacks that are taking your jobs. It's the Blacks that are doing these things. And so what do we do with it? We pay attention. What do you do as a white person? You pay attention to, where do I hold fragility inside of me that is so on the surface that if anything happens, it can quickly burst me open, and right there, I'm back in my racist self, whether it is, obvious or overt racism. But our moments of fragility, our interaction with our fragile selves, that's big, that's powerful, and that's the thing that can help us recognize that when I'm standing in a place of wealth, I can use that wealth to help emancipate all of us, not just me and my family, but all of us. And that is it's a responsibility. That is going back to Ubuntu and recognizing that your thriving should be in service of the whole of humanity and not just yourself.
Can us white people breathe into the discomfort that creates and holds that discomfort, rather than asking Black people to hold it for us? I just think that's key, that somebody in our audience has lightened that up. I'd like to invite either one of you to express the answer to that. And then I think this homework, everyone that we're getting, I know the homework last week was a curious homework for me, and I couldn't just Google it. I had to actually ask some questions. It made me uncomfortable. And I think that is important. So I really invite all of you to do the homework, to work with this, because the only way we transform is by chipping away at something, and then one day we've changed. So although these exercises might seem a little bit, I thought, I can just Google this, and I couldn't. I had to ask the community, and I had to go out there and stick my neck out. And people were really interested. And as a result, I invited some more people to the conversation. So I really would invite our audience, please, tonight, to do the work, because if you don't chip away at something, it's not going to change.
I think that the getting comfortable with discomfort is a critical part of this whole journey. And seeing as next time we're moving into the solar plexus, I think let's defer that conversation to next time, because that is a key part of that robust sense of sort of self-worth and of individuating, is the ability to get more and more comfortable with the discomfort that these conversations bring. But I do resonate with that participant, that this is work that we do need to do amongst ourselves as white people, and that really can help, but also only up to a point, and then we do need to engage and encounter each other. So Makgati, do you want to do a bit of the homework story?
Yes, absolutely. So the invitation for the homework is to go and have a conversation with somebody in your family, and go and check what it is that you are inheriting or have inherited from your lineage, from your bloodline. And what do you do with that? What have you done with that? How have you used what you have inherited? And it'll be interesting to see how you phrase, how you define your inheritance from your family, from your bloodline, and how you are using it or have used it.
And linked to that, if you feel brave enough, also maybe have some of those conversations with somebody in your family about your first experiences of being racialized, when you first realized that you were white or that you were black or that you were in a brown body. Maybe many of us maybe haven't had those conversations with members of our family, and maybe there is some healing that needs to happen there, and we know this healing needs to happen also intergenerationally. So maybe include not just your inheritance, but also your identity, your racialized identity, and your identity, your group identities, all your group identities, English, Afrikaans, you know, a particular nationality, all your group identities. So with that, shall I close for us, Makgati?
Yes, please, with that lovely verse. Yes. Please.
And this is a verse, it's called the verse of gratitude, repentance, and commitment. With gratitude, we remember our parents and all the myriad persons and circumstances that have shaped our lives. We honor the ancestors of this great tradition, all our teachers and friends. We give thanks for health and for this opportunity to practice. With sorrow, we repent our turning away from intimacy and our loss of compassion. We repent the hurt that we have caused through inattention and distractedness, through holding on to opinion and argument, through being lost in ourselves. And we regret the opportunities we may have missed today. With sincerity, we commit to waking up, to embodying a clear mind and an open heart. We vow to give ourselves to this world as it is, to stand in the shoes of the other, whoever they may be, and to never stop trying. May our practice be a healing for ourselves and for all beings.